Joel Richardson is our special guest. His website is joels-trumpet.com. And Joel, is there any way that we can all live in harmony without this constant threat of war, or the constant threat of the tension that we're living with these days, and what's going on in the Middle East? Is there any way that we can ascertain global peace?
Well, absolutely. The day will come, as I mentioned, when Jesus himself will return from heaven, and he will destroy those who are bound and determined not to have peace. Unfortunately, there is evil in the world. Mm-hmm. And when you have 1.4, 1.5 billion individuals who have been born into a tradition which teaches them that they cannot have utopia, they cannot have Islamic paradise until, as I mentioned earlier, until the Jews are killed, until the final Holocaust is completed. How can we expect the nation of Israel to sit down at the table with individuals like this who are determined to kill them and treat them as peace partners? It's really unfair of President Bush and Condoleezza Rice to go over and expect the Israelis to accept a peace with a people, 70% of which want to see them destroyed. Now, as you mentioned earlier, I've lived in the Middle East, and
yes.
A good percentage of the Israelis are members of the Labor Party. They're individuals that want nothing more but to have a place somewhere in the world where they can raise their children without fear of being killed simply because they're Jews. And for that reason, the Bible gives us the glad tidings that the day will come when Jesus himself will return, and he will give the nation of Israel peace with her surrounding nations, the surrounding neighbors, but the peace will come after victory. The peace will come after Jesus himself specifically destroys the nations that are bound and determined to destroy Israel. And unfortunately, until then, we won't have peace.
What was it like living over there?
Well, it depends where you are. The nation of Israel itself is a very, very, very liberal nation. The majority of Israelis are not religious. In certain places, it's not much different than living in San Francisco. Mm-hmm. And definitely a very, very loose society. On the other hand, when you cross the border from Israel into Egypt, it's similar to crossing from, San Diego into Baja, Mexico. You've entered into a completely different world. And now let me mention, I've obviously been a little bit hard on the Islamic tradition. I love Muslim people. Arabic culture is an incredibly hospitable culture. People will welcome you into their homes to sit down, to drink tea, to chat. And there is certainly a majority of Muslims who are, and I'm not going to say moderate Muslims, I'm going to say they're liberal Muslims. Although they are raised under Islam, they choose to follow their conscience as opposed to following the example of Muhammad, who himself was a very violent individual, a very narcissistic, controlling individual, filled with intolerance and hatred. And so there are certainly many Muslims that are liberal Muslims who do not follow strictly the violent tenets of Islam and so forth. And I tend to really, really love that culture. I mean, I fit in very well with it. Unfortunately, there are those who do follow Islam, the fundamentalists who do follow the Quran and the example of Muhammad, and they make it very difficult. When I was in the city of Hurghada, which is called Hurghada in English, it's Kurdaka in Arabic, I walked up to the scene of what was the first uprising of Al-Ikhwan, the Egyptian Brotherhood, and that night there were 6 people that had been murdered about probably a minute before I walked into the scene, and there were a few German tourists and a few Egyptian locals that had been murdered. This type of thing now is happening quite frequently in Egypt, and unfortunately, my mother's warnings, you can't go over there, it's dangerous, was was proven true. But the truth being, you're probably less safe in Chicago today than you are in many sections of the Middle East. But it's certainly a different world. Certainly a very different world than what we're used to over here.
What are some of the proofs, Joel, that we are truly living in the end times?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the Bible makes it very clear that in the last days there would be an empire that would reemerge from the Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
And the Bible gives us very specific names and locations of the nations that would be part of this last days empire. Specifically, is the book of Ezekiel 38:39 mentions that we would see the emergence of the empire led by Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Iran, Libya, Sudan, that these nations would begin to form a coalition, and then it says, and many nations with you. And today we are literally seeing the emergence of this coalition of nations, this unification of the radical nations of Iran, Syria, Lebanon. Political commentators refer to this as the Shia Crescent. We've recently seen the election of the AKP party in Turkey, who are Islamists. Now, Turkey is really the longest-lasting secular nation in the Middle East. As I mentioned, since 1924, Turkey has been a largely secular Islamic nation. Recently, we saw the Islamists take over, and under the administration of Prime Minister Erdogan and President Gül, we are seeing the creeping Islamization of one of the more secular nations in the Middle East. And Turkey is taking a leadership role in all of these things. And we're also seeing the move toward what the Bible refers to as the covenant of death. It's a 7-year peace treaty that it says the nation of Israel would enter into with the surrounding nations, and it would be a peace treaty that would eventually be broken. Now, I mentioned some of the parallels and the anti-parallels earlier between Islamic apocalyptic belief and what the Bible teaches. The Antichrist, according to the Bible, would enter into this 7-year peace treaty with Israel, and then in Islamic tradition, the Islamic Mahdi would also specifically rule for a period of 7 years. So the Islamic Messiah figure would reign for 7 years, and he would enter into a covenant with Israel specifically during that time, and this covenant would be mediated with an individual who they say would be a Levite, a priest. And so there again, you have another very strikingly clear parallel. So as we're seeing in the Middle East, we're seeing the push now, even under the Bush administration, for a peace treaty with between Israel and the surrounding nations. We're seeing the beginning of the emergence of this revived Islamic Caliphate. We're seeing all of the signs that the Bible says would be present in the last days. We're seeing them emerge right before our eyes right now in the Middle East.
Joel Richardson's our guest this hour, Exonation. His website is www.joels-trumpet.com. When you're out talking about your books, Joel, and you're meeting people around the world, what is the general feeling about people when they're talking to you about Islam, and are people necessarily totally negative towards Islam, or are they just wondering why there's so much hatred, so much negativity?
Well, as you know, Rob, the ideas of religious pluralism really dominate the Western mindset, and so many in the United States and in the West would just love to believe the old adage that all paths lead to the same place, and that all religions at their core are essentially good, and all religions are essentially from God, and they all share these common traits. But they failed to take into consideration that perhaps 1,400 years ago in the Middle East, that someone like a David Koresh or like a Jim Jones rose up, a cult leader, a narcissist at the core, and rather than being wiped out in the jungles of Guyana or rather than being, murdered by the American government, Muhammad succeeded and his religion spread. And unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, there is evil in the world. And so while few people in the West really want to face up to the fact that Islam at its core is an intolerant, militaristic, totalitarian ideology, they don't want to admit that a world religion could be at its very core an evil, oppressive force in the earth. They don't want to face that fact. They'd rather say Islam is a religion of peace that's been hijacked by radicals. The fact of the matter is that anyone who truly studies the source texts of Islam, who truly studies the life and example of Muhammad, will have nothing other than to admit the fact that it is an evil religion. Let me just give you another few examples.
Sure.
The Bible says that the Antichrist, in the book of Daniel, would show no regard for the desire of women. And that's been debated as far as what that means. But a lot of people say it simply means that the Antichrist would show no regard for women's rights, for the desires of women. Now, it was Muhammad himself who, in his 50s, married a 6-year-old girl and then consummated that relationship just before her 9th birthday when he was in his mid-50s. It was Muhammad himself who claimed to have a vision of hell, and he declared that the majority of the inhabitants of hell were women. It was Muhammad himself who, in discussing the Islamic law, that in court the testimony of a woman is only half as good as a man, and that you need 2 women to equal the testimony of 1 man. And Muhammad said, well, that is because women are deficient in intelligence to men. So when you have this individual that Muslims look to literally as the role model for all of humanity, as the perfect man, Islam is undeniably the premier force in terms of oppressing women and violating women's rights throughout the earth today. And there is no one, whether they're the most, given over to religious pluralism and determined to believe that all religions are good, there is no one who will concede to the notion that that is good in any way, shape, or form. Just in Pakistan, just this past week, a 9-year-old girl who was married to a man in his 40s desired to be divorced. As a result, her family killed her because she was bringing shame to the family. A 9-year-old girl married to a 40-year-old man. That is evil, and that is something that whether we're extremely conservative or extremely liberal, we cannot tolerate. Here in the United States, we value these principles of openness and tolerance, and these are wonderful principles that made this nation a great nation. But unfortunately, we've literally made a national idol to this concept of tolerance. And we need to take the principles of human rights, civil liberties, freedoms, and we need to always prioritize those above tolerance. Unfortunately, Islam forces us to choose between those two, because within Islam, you cannot have both. You cannot tolerate Islam, which is at its very core, a freedom-destroying, human rights violating ideology. And all one really needs to do is look to any nation throughout the earth that attempts to practice Islamic law, whether it be Saudi Arabia or Iran or Afghanistan under the Taliban, and you will see some of the most gross violations of human rights, women's rights, children's rights, non-Muslim rights, and Muslims as well, of any nation throughout the world. Muslims are always the first victims of Islam. And so as we discuss these things, I'll be accused of intolerance and hatred and that sort of thing. Not at all. Not at all. If I love someone, I'm going to tell them the truth, and I'm going to stand up for the Muslim that's oppressed, as well as the non-Muslim that's oppressed. And it's a dark, dark picture. But as I said, if one believes in the Bible, that the day will come when all of these things will be corrected and all of these things will be righted, and indeed the world will live in peace in the near days to come.
Joel, stand by. We've got to take our final break. Joel Richardson is our guest. www.joels-trumpet.com. When we come back, we'll take a look at who's going to be with us tomorrow night here on the X Zone, live and around the world from our studios in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada.
Peace on earth, let it be.